Welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing heart failure. So in this video we're finally going to discuss cardiomyopathy as a cause of heart failure. And remember, this word literally means disease affecting the heart muscle. So it means disease affecting the muscle that makes up the wall of any of the four chambers of the heart. So you can have cardiomyopathy of the muscle of the left atrium, cardiomyopathy of the muscle of the left ventricle, cardiomyopathy of the muscle of the right ventricle, and cardiomyopathy of the muscle of the right atrium. Now, by and large, cardiomyopathy of the atria is not massively important and will not alone lead to heart failure. You see, even though the atria do contract, a process called atrial systole, and push blood into the ventricles, the amount that they actually push in is very, very small. Most of the blood that the ventricles refill with in diastole comes when the atria are relaxing as well. So when both of them are relaxing in full diastole, the blood comes in either through the pulmonary veins for the left heart or the superior and the inferior vena cava for the right heart and fills both the atria and the ventricles. Then, of course, atrial systole happens, only a tiny bit more is then added into the ventricles, and then the ventricles contract, and the amount that they push out is not hugely changed by that tiny amount that comes from the atria. Therefore, if there is a problem with the atria contracting because you have atrial cardiomyopathy, it does not massively actually change cardiac output. So we don't get hugely fussed about atrial cardiomyopathy. Cardiomyopathy of the ventricles, however, is much, much more significant, and that can lead to heart failure. However, having said that, cardiomyopathy of the atria is regardless very common and very interesting, because you have to think, why has that cardiomyopathy occurred to that atria? Specifically, often you see cardiomyopathy of the left atrium, you see dilated cardiomyopathy of the left atrium, and often you need to then think, well, why has the left atrium changed in this way? And often there will be something else wrong with the heart that has caused that left atrial cardiomyopathy, and that other thing that is wrong may well be causing heart failure. So cardiomyopathy of the atria is common, and even though it's not going to cause heart failure in itself, whatever has caused that cardiomyopathy may be causing heart failure. So you should always think, if you see cardiomyopathy of the atria, think, why has that actually occurred, and is that the cause of this actually causing heart failure in the individual? Right, we'll talk about that more as we develop our understanding of cardiomyopathy. Now, a warning. This is really, really quite crude, the way that we categorize cardiomyopathies. Astonishingly crude. Quite simply, we categorize it by anatomy, not by any fancy histology or pathology or mechanism or anything like that. The mechanisms aren't very well understood at all. We quite simply image the heart, and the best imaging modality is an echo. Well, actually, the best imaging modality is a cardiac MRI, but no one gets cardiac MRI. So the main imaging modality is an echo. You can also sometimes see this on CT. In particular, you can see left atrial dilated cardiomyopathy often on CT. I see that a lot when I look at CTs. However, we'll forget CT. The main way you see this is by doing an echo. That looks at all four chambers and can tell you about whether there is cardiomyopathy of the walls of those four chambers. And we categorize it in two ways. So there are two main ways the walls can change. There is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and then there is dilated cardiomyopathy. What happens in each of them? So let's talk about them as regards to the left ventricle. So if the left ventricle is affected by hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, what happens is the wall becomes massively thickened. So to alter this picture here, what would happen is it would become massively thickened like so. So this would now be the wall of the left ventricle. All the muscle has hypertrophied, and all this bit that I'm colouring in white is now left ventricle wall. That is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So you can see that on echo. If that has happened to the muscle of any one of the four chambers, then we would call that hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Now, Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy only tends to happen to the ventricles. You won't ever really see hypertrophic cardiomyopathy of the atria. So this can affect the left ventricle and the right ventricle. And now I kind of need to delete that from my picture because I want to show you dilated cardiomyopathy, but I don't know a way of doing it without undoing it, and then I'd lose my LVRV annotation. Never mind. So we'll leave it. Dilated cardiomyopathy, in contrast, if you have dilated cardiomyopathy, what would happen is the ventricle would become much, much bigger and the wall would become much, much thinner. So imagine that that other bit isn't there now. Imagine that all of this, the hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, imagine all that's been taken out and now we've got a really, really thin left ventricular wall that has dilated hugely. That is dilated cardiomyopathy. And again, that can affect all four chambers of the heart. So this can affect the left ventricle, the right ventricle, and it can affect the atria too. So the left atrium and the right atrium. And as I say, left atrial dilated cardiomyopathy is quite common, and you can see that usually on CT. You don't even need an echo for that. You can see the massive left atrium. So hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, one type of cardiomyopathy, dilated cardiomyopathy, another type of cardiomyopathy. Hypertrophic, usually you will only ever see that in the left ventricle or the right ventricle. You call that left ventricular hypertrophy, right ventricular hypertrophy for the right ventricle. Dilated cardiomyopathy can affect all four chambers of the heart, including the atria, even though it doesn't really matter in the atria except for trying to figure out why it's happened, but it can also occur in the ventricles. So let's now explore why this can happen and why it can cause heart failure, i.e. the heart to not be able to pump enough blood. So which one should we do first? Should we talk causes or should we explain why it can cause heart failure? So let's first explain why it can cause heart failure. So the mechanism is actually different. If you've got hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, let's say of the left ventricle here, the reason that that leads to heart failure isn't because it's weak. Now, look at this, it's enormous, absolutely enormous. The main reason this leads to heart failure is that it massively small, it makes the actual chamber size hugely smaller. So there's hardly any room for blood. So even though this might be big and thick and powerful, it can't actually pump that much blood because there just isn't enough space for the blood to come in. So it actually only holds a tiny amount of blood, chucks maybe all of that blood out, but that's hardly anything. So therefore, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy of the left ventricle or the right ventricle leads to heart failure. In contrast, dilated cardiomyopathy, you've got a huge amount of blood in the chamber, but this wall is so weak that it pumps hardly any of it out at all. So left ventricular dilated cardiomyopathy or right ventricular dilated cardiomyopathy, that is going to lead to heart failure. Left atrial dilated cardiomyopathy and right atrial dilated cardiomyopathy, as I say, it doesn't in itself lead to heart failure. What really you're thinking about if you see atrial dilated cardiomyopathy is what has caused that cardiomyopathy, because that thing might be causing heart failure. But because they pump so little blood anyway, they affect the cardiac output so little, it doesn't actually matter if you've got dilated cardiomyopathy of the atria. So that's how it can lead to heart failure. Let's now talk about the causes of cardiomyopathy, both hypertrophic and dilated. Now, again, this is a place where our understanding is not brilliant. There are lots of different processes that can lead to cardiomyopathy, but some of them we can say they nearly always lead to either hypertrophic cardiomyopathy or dilated cardiomyopathy. Others, it's kind of the case that they might cause hypertrophic cardiomyopathy or they might cause dilated cardiomyopathy. It's a mixed picture and we don't properly understand why the heart might go down one route versus the other. So let's start off with some of the major causes. So ischemic heart disease, called ischemic cardiomyopathy. What is this? So ischemic heart disease is incredibly common. It's disease of the coronary arteries. Let's just add on the coronary arteries. Remember, there are two main coronary arteries. The right coronary artery comes off the aorta and then goes down like so, gives off a branch that comes down like here, supplies the right side of the heart, and the left coronary artery comes off the aorta like this, goes around the back as well and gives off a major branch coming down here, which is the left anterior descending artery. And this, of course, is the left circumflex. This is the right marginal, I believe, but don't quote me on that. So the important thing is there are these coronary arteries that supply the myocardial muscle with blood. These coronary arteries can become diseased over time. Atherosclerosis can affect them. They become stenotic and not enough blood gets to the heart muscle. There are two ways that this can damage the heart muscle. Either you can have an actual heart attack, and remember, in a heart attack you get acute thrombosis forming in the already narrowed artery. So let's just draw a picture of the artery. So if we have the artery here, so let's say that's a normal coronary artery with no disease. This is a abnormal coronary artery, so it's narrowed because of atherosclerosis occurring within its wall. That disease in the wall of the artery makes it far more likely that a thrombus will form in the blood vessel. So remember, blood clots should not form in blood vessels. Healthy blood vessels are able to prevent the blood from clotting within them. Blood is only supposed to clot if there's a hole in the side of the blood vessel, and then it's supposed to clot to fill in that hole. So it's never supposed to be activated in an intact blood vessel. And in healthy blood vessels, it wouldn't be. However, in diseased blood vessels, the clotting process can be activated, and that is called thrombosis. And that can cause complete occlusion of the blood vessel. So here is the thrombus forming inside that blood vessel. And when that happens, let's say if it occurs in the left anterior descending artery here, it will acutely cut off all blood supply to this portion of the heart muscle, and that portion of the heart muscle will then infarct and die. And that's obviously what we call a heart attack or an MI. So that is one way in which you can get cardiomyopathy from ischemic heart disease, from huge portions of the heart muscle dying and being replaced by scar tissue. That usually leads to dilated cardiomyopathy. So that if you imagine all this muscle being replaced by sort of scar tissue with just a tiny bit of muscle left that managed to survive the heart attack, then you can sort of imagine how that makes the wall thinner, and how the scar tissue, which can't contract properly, will get pulled. This is kind of a bad explanation, but you can sort of imagine how that would lead to dilated cardiomyopathy rather than hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. The heart muscle, by the way, can't be replaced in a heart attack. Once it's dead, it's gone. And indeed, in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, this is a really interesting point, and I do actually want to come to this. So it really fascinates me that the two of the most incredible organs in the body, the brain and the heart, have basically no cell division within them, and they don't have the capacity to divide. So if cells of the brain or cells of the heart die, either because of a heart attack or a stroke respectively, you can't actually replace those cells by cell division, just because the neurons and the myocardiocytes don't have the ability to divide. If you contrast that to other organs that seem far less important, which can divide fantastically, like, the gastrointestinal tract, you have a huge amount of cell division, the skin, you have a huge amount of cell division, the liver can replace itself phenomenally well if it's injured in some way. But the heart and the brain have absolutely zero capacity, really, for cell division. So once you've lost cells, you've lost them permanently, and instead they are replaced by scar tissue. And when hypertrophic cardiomyopathy occurs, when you get this massive thickening, you might think, well, how has that occurred if you can't get cell division? Well, it doesn't. All the cells in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy get bigger rather than them dividing. So this thickened wall isn't produced by producing more cardiomyocytes. No, it's produced by the cardiomyocytes getting bigger. Every single cardiomyocyte goes from being that to being that. And that's how you get the massive thickening of the heart muscle. And I believe it's the same in the skeletal muscle. I think, when these bodybuilders have huge, huge muscles, I don't believe they actually have any more cells than they had when they were, a skinny teenager. All that's happened is all the muscle cells have got massively bigger, hypertrophied. And that's the same in the heart here. So the point to that was that if you have an MI and you lose a whole bunch of cardiomyocytes, they don't ever get replaced. Instead, they're replaced by scar tissue. And then you can kind of imagine that scar tissue isn't going to be able to contract. And the pressures in this are quite high. So you can sort of imagine that scar tissue getting stretched and stretched and stretched, and therefore ending up with a dilated, very, very weak wall because it's mainly made up of scar tissue. So MIs can cause ischemic a cardiomyopathy, a dilated cardiomyopathy, and we call that ischemic cardiomyopathy. And of course, MIs can affect the left ventricle, the right ventricle, the left atrium, the right atrium. So in all of them, MIs can lead to a dilated cardiomyopathy, and we call that ischemic cardiomyopathy. In addition, it might not actually be necessary for you to actually have a heart attack in order for ischemic heart disease to cause cardiomyopathy. The chronic lack of blood supply from a narrowed artery might be enough to actually gradually just weaken the heart muscle cells, or actually kill a few off over time for them just to die because of lack of oxygen. And therefore, you might be able to end up with dilated cardiomyopathy just from the ischemic heart disease itself, rather than from the actual acute thrombotic episodes that cause myocardial infarction. So be aware of that. So ischemic cardiomyopathy, it's a dilated cardiomyopathy, and it just means that the muscle has become ill because of lack of blood supply. And it's a very, very common form of cardiomyopathy, or rather a very, very common cause of cardiomyopathy. Next, hypertension is a cause of cardiomyopathy, and this is called hypertensive heart disease, so HHD for short, or you could call it hypertensive cardiomyopathy. So I talked about how hypertension alone can precipitate heart failure without cardiomyopathy, that the ventricles might be perfectly healthy but just not able to cope with these phenomenal pressures in the arteries, and that can precipitate heart failure. However, it can also actually lead to cardiomyopathy, which is then a permanent heart failure. And by the way, these other causes that we've gone through so far, hypertension, valvulopathies, if you repair the hypertension or you repair the valvulopathies, you can repair the heart failure. If you have got cardiomyopathy, something actually wrong with the heart muscle, we cannot fix this at present. You have got permanent heart failure in that case. And this is why I used to think of this as being what people meant when they wrote heart failure in someone's past medical history, because I used to think heart failure means you can never get rid of it because the muscle is actually too weak permanently. And that's not the case. That's a major misunderstanding. Do not think that heart failure and cardiomyopathy are synonymous. They are not. Cardiomyopathy is a permanent form or a permanent disease that is going to lead to permanent heart failure. Unless you get a heart transplant, that's the only way to fix it at present. So, if you have long-term systemic hypertension, let's say, that leads to the left ventricle having to pump against these high blood pressures for a very, very long time, and it adapts to that strain by hypertrophying. So hypertension leads to a hypertrophic cardiomyopathy over time, and we call this hypertensive heart disease. And again, systemic hypertension leads to LV, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and pulmonary hypertension over time can lead to RV, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So this over time leads to a hypertrophy of the ventricles. Obviously, it will be the one that is actually neighbouring whichever arterial system it is that is hypertensive. So the LV if it's systemic hypertension, the RV if it's pulmonary hypertension. And that takes years for that to happen, years of badly controlled hypertension for you to actually develop hypertensive heart disease or hypertensive hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Next is the last major one that we're going to discuss, which is that valvulopathies can lead to cardiomyopathies. So, for instance, and this one's more complicated. So these two, I've said nicely, what type of cardiomyopathy they lead to. Ischemic leads to dilated cardiomyopathy, hypertension leads to hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Valvulopathies, it's much more open. These can lead to either hypertrophic cardiomyopathy or dilated cardiomyopathy, and it's not really easy to predict what is going to happen in each circumstance. So let me just explain a few examples. So if you have aortic stenosis for years and years and years, this again can lead to left ventricular cardiomyopathy. You would imagine hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, although it's possible that it could lead to dilated cardiomyopathy. So again, just like in hypertension, the left ventricle is going to be pumping against a real resistance if you've got aortic stenosis for years and years and years. And again, that leads to disease of this left ventricle. It leads to adaptations, and it might be the case that it causes it to hypertrophy in adaptation, or it might be the case that it actually leads to it gradually dilating, and you can't really predict which one is actually going to happen. But aortic stenosis can lead to a cardiomyopathy over years of the left ventricle. Similarly, another example, mitral stenosis. If you've got stenosis of the mitral valve here, that's going to be meaning that the left atrium here is really straining to push blood into the left ventricle during atrial systole. And again, that can lead to changes in the muscle of the left atrium. And that will be a dilated cardiomyopathy because the atrium never really hypertrophy. So because the blood from the pulmonary veins isn't going to be able to get into the left ventricle properly if you've got mitral stenosis, you can imagine that blood is going to pool in the left atrium, stretching it more and more and more, and over years that's going to lead to its dilatation. In fact, a huge number of different causes of left heart failure, so heart failure where the pathology is on the left side, will lead to left atrial dilated cardiomyopathy. So if you think, let's go through, for instance, systemic hypertension as a cause of heart failure. That's going to mean that blood isn't moving properly out of the left ventricle. Again, that's going to lead to blood pooling on this side. Remember, we talked about the fact that blood will pool in the pulmonary veins, causing pulmonary venous hypertension, high pressures in the capillaries in the lungs, and blood going into the pulmonary tissue. When that blood pools in the left atrium, you can imagine that the atrium, it's very thin muscle, it's not very strong. It's going to then be stretched chronically, so all sorts of pathologies on the left side of the heart will lead to a left atrial dilated cardiomyopathy, not just mitral stenosis. Any sort of cause generally of left heart failure is going to lead to blood pooling, often in the left atrium and in the pulmonary circulation. And that pooling of the blood in the left atrium is going to stretch it, and over time it will dilate more and more and more and give rise to a dilated left atrial cardiomyopathy. We'll have a break here, and in the next video we'll continue with this discussion of valvulopathies further. There are a few more, not valvulopathies, of cardiomyopathy further.